A very happy and a good evening, all of you. Lovely to meet all of you. Um, Thanks for joining in. We're going to have this quick 30-minute conversation on Ask Me Anything, which is a cybersecurity framework related topics. So just to refresh our memories on what this framework is, I just have a couple of slides and then I'll quickly open it for Q&A. So SEBI, I'm sure all of you recollect that it came up with the cybersecurity framework, CSCRF, and IFSC also came up with some similar requirement. Of course, a smaller, much more easier compared to what the exhaustive list SEBI came up with. So we're going to discuss about that. Before I proceed, I just thought I'll give a quick intro about myself. My name is Narasimhan Elangovan. I specialize in cybersecurity domain and I'm a governance professional. And quick intro about Incorp. Incorp is an Ascentium company. It's a leading global services, business services platform. Predominantly corporate and SME are the specialized area. Headquartered out of Singapore, of course, from India as well, there are significant operations. And close to about 20,000 plus clients across APAC and other things is basically what we have and what we are serving. Okay, so I'll take this conversation quickly a little ahead. Just to give you a perspective, SEBI came up with the cyber security and cyber resilience framework. It came up in August 2023. And at that point in time, it came up with two broad frameworks. One is on cyber security, other is on cyber resilience. It combined all of them and including the prior circulars, everything, and came up with one consolidated framework, and it came up with two broad goals and functions, what you see over here. The first bucket is what you see, the goals, which is evolve, anticipate, withstand, contain, recover. And then you have a cybersecurity function, which talks about governance, identity, protect, detect, respond, and recover. That's basically the second layer. So each of them came up with their own set of requirements, and those are some things which we have already covered in the previous webinars. So I'm sure you will be able to, get some insights from the YouTube channel or LinkedIn related conversation. To whom is this guidelines applicable? Literally everybody. You heard me right, literally everybody. So it's AIF, bankers, debenture trustees, collective investment scheme, all of these stakeholders, this is applicable. It spares nobody, if probably I can use that word. And of course, there are very minimal exemptions as such, which is there. And for the first time, SEBI came up with what is called as a graded approach. The largest of the requirements are for MIIs, then comes to qualified RE, mid-size, small size, and self-certification RE. Self-certification RE is the smaller bucket or the little ones. And then you slowly go on into the larger category. The entire bifurcation of all these five are based on what is called as a threshold or a criteria. For example, if I'm talking about a P fund or a VC fund, it is based on the AUM they manage. If they're talking about a broker, it is based upon the number of unique client codes they have. So each of them have the basis, and based on that, they fit in either of the four categories: qualified, mid-size, small size, or self-certification or self-certified RE. And as far as timelines is concerned, for the larger players, it was 1st of January 2025. There was a regulatory forbearance until 31st of March. On the other end, for all other players, it was April 1st, 2025. SEBI came up and gave a 3 months extension a little later. So therefore, the June 30th is the revised extension, right? And everything by June 30th, you have to make sure you are compliant with. So that's basically the whole spectrum of it. And this exemption does not apply to MII, which I said, and KRA and QRA. Basically, for those who already SEBI had given a 3 month extension, this is not applicable. For the rest of them, you are getting a 3 month extension. So please bear in mind, you need to be compliant from 1st of July, because the first year you'll have to give a self-certification or a declaration, or you have to, if you fall under any category other than self-certification, audit is mandatory, and therefore an independent auditor will examine and give you a report. So therefore it becomes mandatory as well. So that's basically what I wanted to give a quick insights, maybe a quick tidbit sort of a thing, just to refresh our memory. And I thought we'll leave the floor open for questions. And if there are any questions, we'll be happy to take it. And that's the whole purpose of this Ask Me sort of a series. If you do have questions, there is an option in the chat. Please do enter it there. And you could also uh, probably raise your hand in case it's slightly more detailed. We could also try to cover it that place. Because if there are very limited questions, I'll try also to give you some perspectives on what are some of the challenges which people are facing, where they're getting hung up and things like that. Bring in that perspective as well. Okay, I see a couple of them coming there. Um, in terms of timelines, just to refresh everybody's memory, the timelines are 1st of January was the initial timeline. This got extended to 31st of March with what is called as regulatory forbearance, and that's for the first category of people whom you see here. However, for all other categories, they gave an extension until April 1st, but that was basically the due date. But it so happened that, SEBI gave a one-time relaxation as well because this is the first time which is applicable. So technically, for all categories, it is June 30th. The only thing which matters or changes, etc., is from June 30th, you will have to ensure the rest of the categories are adhering to it. So hopefully that gives you a perspective. Also, another question or another point which you have to keep in mind is majority of them have multiple milestones or timelines within this particular thing. For example, you need to do a quarterly sort of a compliance, you need to do a monthly sort of a compliance, a yearly sort of a compliance. So those things based on your graded approach, it would probably fall under that. The next question I can see is how does CSCRF differ from the traditional IT security policy? Just to give you a heads up, many a times what happens is the IT security policy speaks only about the access, maybe some of the roles, maybe it might go to extent of understanding or explaining the change management and things like that. So there are probably about 5 to 10 broad buckets which the traditional IT policies will focus on. The cybersecurity, cyber resilience focus a little bit extra in terms of the resilience perspective. And more than the resilience, I would probably say, how are you ensuring you're able to showcase continuity? So those are few things which is something which is important. And that is something which organizations are finding a little hard to go ahead and define. But it is definitely something which is solvable considering the timeline which is there. To just give some perspectives, resilience talks about how your network infra resilience, your team members, the IT equipments. So all of these, how it has been dealt with, all of those tries to come out there. I see a question, what is the kind of declaration to be submitted on July 1st? So there's no declaration to be submitted. Let me clarify this. The applicability of regulation is from July 1. You will have to submit your first compliance report after the end of the financial year if you are a small size or a mid size. If you're a qualified or a market institution, you have to give a yearly 2 audits has to be done, and that audit report has to be done by a certain empaneled entity, and they have to issue a report on your compliance status. So this all will happen during the year or subsequent after the year end. So if it's a half year, maybe around September to October window, you'll have to submit this. If it is once a year, typically after end of the year, maybe April and May window will be given, you will have to submit this. The cutoff period for the deadlines, they have not mentioned. They just mentioned yearly or half yearly submission. What do small size Okay. Do they have to appoint a full-time CISO? Interestingly, there is no mandatory requirement of CISO for anybody. They've just said that you need to appoint a governance professional who will be necessary to take care of all of these, right? So they don't define that CISO is mandatory. Okay, so that is something which you should be aware of. Most of the times, what happens is the CISO is more of a role or a function. It is given for certain categories. And for MII and qualified RE, which is market institution and qualified RE, they say you need to designate a senior officer as a CISO from a compliance perspective. This is to ensure more of periodical, responses, measures, etc. For the other categories, as I said, you just need to designate a person as a designated officer, as the name suggests. A CISO is not mandatory. So hopefully that gives you some clarification. Next, is SEBI offering any funding or grant for compliance with CSCRF? Unfortunately, no. It's a compliance initiative, so I don't think it is practical. But what it might definitely do is give some sort of exemption, uh, probably in due course, listening to some of the difficulties. Now, what is the frequency of audits? That's another popular question which keeps on coming. I just thought I'll give you this slide where you get some perspective, right? If you can just look over here, this is typically just some illustrative examples. Ignore the, of course, this is typically what we as Incorp do, but you can probably look into the last 4 to 5, you get some visibility as what is the frequency of these audits. The cyber audits for some of the players are once in a year, and for the largest of the player, it is probably twice in a year, right? So just so that you get an idea about how it is. And of course, some committees have to be set up, periodical training has to be done, right? Security monitoring. In fact, one of the other challenge which most of them are today speaking about is SOC, right? We'll cover about SOC in a couple of minutes from now, but that is also something which you should probably look into it. Okay. Uh, VAPT. Okay, so Vikas says RE must perform VAPT of critical systems at the start, but RBI regulated entity, we perform VAPT at the start of which is valid for 1 year. In our case, do we need? So if you've already done a VAPT, I think we can definitely use that. You need not do multiple VAPTs. At the end of the day, the risk is basically what you look into. But again, look into the frequency, because I think certain cases, your vulnerability penetration testing, of course, it is mandatory that you do once a year and submit that report. But if there are any changes, key upgrades, etc., functional changes, they make a reference that it makes sense for you to relook into that perspective. Okay, what is the documentation required? Okay, documentation is a little tricky question. The reason is because many a times pure documentation alone will not solve the purpose. It should be document backed by evidence. Okay, so just to give you an example, just to give you some perspective, you require certain policies. Now, what are the policies? Maybe the first thing is your governance, your access control, your resilience policy, your framework relating to that. So you need to draft all of these, right? That is on one side. Second, all of these should be implemented and you need to have evidence for that as well. So that's also another tricky thing. So from a policy, I would say first would obviously be a cyber security and cyber resilience policy, right? So that's the very first thing. And this is not only drafted, it should be subject to periodically review and other things. Next is a few other incidental things, like your asset management policy may have to be fine-tuned. Your vulnerability management has to be fine-tuned based on what we just made a mention. You may have to probably require an audit policy, because you'll have to audit the framework and guidelines, right? The change management policy, in case you're using your own software development policy. So these are few examples which you should need to have. You can also have certain things privacy related, so that is also something which you can probably do consider. The other question on the VAPT, just to also clarify, in case a VAPT has an issue, right? And those issues also have to be submitted in terms of a remediation within 45 days of the remediation. That is something which you will have to look into it. And as you rightly pointed out, you need to plan it at the beginning of the year, and you shall submit it within 1 month of completion of the VAPT activity. Okay. So, of course, this submission is to the IT committee. It's not to the SEBI as such. But yes, in case there are findings, etc., that also has to be put across. What are the penalty for non-compliance? Unfortunately, the framework does not speak about penalty clause. But what happens is SEBI has certain other powers under Section 11 of the SEBI Act. It can definitely enforce those requirements. So it will say that, it could be held responsible under those regulations. So therefore, you'll have to probably take some guidance from that. Okay, next question. Can you give me some examples about what kinds of governance structure? Okay. So you have to just talk about governance as a whole, right? I will probably just bring up this setup, right? It talks about defining roles and responsibilities. It talks about the tone at the top. It talks about the CSCRF policy as such. It also makes a mention that you need to appoint a designated officer, which I just mentioned. Policies have to be subject to a review, and they should be periodically reported in terms of the findings, issues, etc. You are free to perform an internal audit, etc. If especially if it's larger organizations, perform internal audits and be compliant with that. And please note, even if it's a proprietor or a partnership firm, this requirements will be applicable. So each of them will have to be treated accordingly, right? So that's something which you should be aware of. There will also be a charter document where roles and responsibilities are defined. And as I said, the CISO is mandatory for the larger two players. The smaller buckets, it is sort of flexible. A risk management policy is also necessary. And if you're talking about new regulations which is coming up, including the DPDP Act, it is mandatory to showcase compliance for all of this. So that's typically how it is being done. And I would probably say the role of governance is not just that; it'll go beyond that, because you need to make sure you are compliant, etc. In case you're using new softwares or new procurements, there is something called as an SBOM, software bill of material, which is a detailed requirements as to the software. Those also has to be documented and captured. So that's basically on the governance layer. What are the key components that's may be included in the cybersecurity policy? Now, in terms of key components, it will be predominantly going into each of these line items in the framework, right? Now, it will talk about some elements which I just mentioned, the governance layer, the identification of assets. So, if you recollect, we spoke about the goals and the objectives. So, all of those have to be clearly covered. In addition, it should also talk about something called as the standard and guidelines, which is mentioned in the SEBI cybersecurity framework, which is nothing but part B and part C. So those things also have to be covered. The elements of risk management, risk register, how you treat the assets, right? And it could also be acting as an umbrella policy, giving guidance to the other policies. So those are also things which you should probably try to cover. So all of these will become the requirement. Okay. We manage a SEBI regulated AIF category 2 having a size of 750 crore, but are not involved in any kind of monetary transaction. We are only the investment management. Okay. Unfortunately, because I think yours is more than 750 crore, I think you would fall under the mid-size RE, because 1,000 crore plus is the qualified. So up to I think 500 to 1,000 is a mid-size RE. Mid-size RE is unfortunately required to have a SOC. The only way in which you can get some exemption or relaxation is probably choosing to go for a market SOC. And market SOC is basically a player which is established by SEBI, sorry, stock exchange. They are actually providing these services. Maybe they could probably help you out. How should institution classify the digital assets for risk prioritization? This is predominantly risk rating and ranking and asset identification. There is a requirement within the framework which talks about asset identification, critical assets, non-critical assets, and you'll have to focus on that. Shruti is asking a very relevant question: is VAPT mandatory? Unfortunately, it is mandatory for all, right? Even if you have a no publicly facing asset, even if you're using a SaaS based application, etc., because the law says or the requirement says. So I think with the way we are interpreting it is at least do a VAPT scan of your network, and then it should be a minimal cost, give a report, scan report, and then close the matter, right? So that you're not going too much into the depth of it. So I think that is something which is required. Unfortunately, again, the requirement is this VAPT also has to be done only through a certain empaneled entity, right? So just keep that in mind. If you don't have an application, interpret it from a network angle. How do we check for readiness gaps? It's a little tricky question because you'll have to go through first identify what category you fall under. Once you know what category you fall under, what are the requirements under each category? Only if you know these two requirements, you can start identifying where you are ready, where you're actually failing. Because the trouble would be otherwise that you will not be able to understand where are you stuck, right? And generally, that is why I suggest a professional's help would make it very, very easier for you. Also, bear in mind from a third party or a vendor risk management per se, there are also additional requirements. It says that your vendors also have to be compliant with some of these requirements. In fact, some of the companies have gone to an extent where they say the vendor also has to prove the CSCRF requirements for me. They've gone to that extent as at least the larger listed entities, etc. So you may have to probably relook into it, right? So please take care of that. There are also requirements of ISO 27001 certification. The largest two, which is MII and qualified RE, have to get an ISO 27001 done. The next question is, I have an IT policy. Do we need to require a separate cyber policy? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. The reason is because the IT policy may not be comprehensively covering all the requirements of CSCRF. So in your case, Dolly, what you should probably consider is update the CSCRF requirements into the IT policy. I think that should be the way in which you should probably try to deal with it. All right, so we're almost nearing time. We'll probably take one or two more questions. Is it mandate to be compliant from June? Can we do this compliance at the end of the financial? Okay, interesting question. Many of them are of the view that, we'll comply by end of the financial year. Unfortunately, no. The reason is because if we are probably, compliant by end of financial year, that means from July 1st till the end of the financial year, you're not compliant throughout the period, only for select period. And imagine if you have to if you are subject to an audit for the next year, which is applicable in most of the out of five categories, four of them it is applicable. The auditor is simply going to flag that, you have been compliant only from so and so date. So that's a clear cut violation. So I think you'll have to be a little cautious there. So kindly start doing at the earliest. Of course, year one, we might have a little bit relaxed, but I think it'll start picking up. Okay, I'll probably take this as the last question. What additional precautions are suggested for use of mobile banking applications? So since most of the CSCRF are applicable for market side and not purely on the banking side, I don't see that as a huge requirement. Again, if it instead of banking application, it could be any application. I'll probably use that way, right? Mobile app, web app, etc. Mandatory, you need to have a VAPT. You need to have an SBOM, software bill of material, and document that. Do a risk assessment, and if you are a larger player, do that twice a year. If you are a smaller player, do it once a year. Submit this report in case of any violations or failures. I think we should be in a position to report that. Right. So these are some things which you should definitely have a look into. I think we have got most of it. So what we will do is, since I've given you a perspective of what this entire setup is, hopefully you've got some idea and clarity. I know it might be a very short conversation for us to discuss everything, but I did give you some perspective. If you have any questions, I think you have our contact details. Please go ahead and send us your email. We are happy to uh, respond to you. And again, we have a LinkedIn channel, so please keep following us. We do a lot of interesting things, keep on sharing information and content. So feel free to, keep watching those information. And hopefully I've added some small value into this 30 minutes. Thank you so much for being a very, very patient audience. Take care then. Bye-bye.